Tonight a man is walking north through weather that has been trying to kill him for 2 days. He is alone. He is hurt. And there are 7 of them behind him in the dark. Somewhere ahead of him, on a hill with no name, there is a ruin. A tower that 2 kingdoms failed to keep. Below it, under 2,000 years of fallen stone, there is a room with a door that still closes. And against his chest, in a case of waxed hide, he carries a small black book that 100 men have carried before him. He has not written in it for 8 months. Tonight he will. So get warm, turn the light down, and let us walk the last few miles with him. Before we begin, a word, and then I will leave you to it. If you find something here that helps you rest, the kindest thing you can do is stay a while. Subscribe so the next story finds you on the night you need it. And if there is a world you would like to fall asleep in, tell me in the comments. I read them. And more than one story on this channel began as somebody's request. These stories also live on Spotify, if you would rather listen with the screen dark and the phone face down. The link is waiting in the description. That is all now. Get comfortable. Let your shoulders come down. Let the room go quiet around you. The rain is already falling. Rain. 2 days of it now, and it had stopped being weather. It had become the shape of the world. The thing the world was made of. The thing that filled the space between the trees, and the space inside his boots, and the space behind his eyes. Very immort. There was no other verb left in him. The ground at the Trollshalls had given up being ground somewhere before dusk. It was a slow brown river now, ankle deep in the hollows, and each step had to be pulled free of it with a sound like something unwilling. His boots had been good boots once, brie leather, mended 4 times, and dry the day before yesterday. He could not remember what that had felt like. The cold was the thing he watched, not the rain. The rain was only water, and water was patient and stupid and could be endured. The cold was different. The cold had a plan. It came in at the wrists first, always the wrists, then the small of the back, and then it settled into the joints of the fingers and began the slow work of taking his grip away from him, 1 degree at a time, so gently that a man could lose his hand and not notice until the moment he needed it. He flexed his fingers inside the wet leather, made a fist, opened it, made a fist. This was not comfort, it was arithmetic. Low under his left ribs, there was a cut 2 nights old. He had taken it east of the last bridge, in the dark, through his own carelessness, and there was no one to blame for it, and he had not tried. He had done what could be done with cold water and a strip of linen, and it had held, and it was holding still. But the bandage had gone wet, and then gone warm, and now it clung to the meat of him, and moved when he moved, and every 4th or 5th step, it reminded him that it was there, politely, the way a creditor reminds you. He did not stop for it. Stopping was a decision, and decisions cost more than walking. Against his chest, beneath the leather in the wall, in a case of waxed hide the size of 2 hands laid together, there was a book. It was not a large book. It was not a beautiful one. Its cover had gone black with old grease and older rain, and the stitching down its spine had been redone by 5 different men across 5 different centuries. It was the heaviest thing Berrien carried. Every ranger of the north knew what it was. It moved from shelter to shelter along the old roads, left in a hollow of stone for the next man, and the next and the next. 100 years of them, writing down what they had seen. The ford is passable. The bridge holds. There is something in the north. Do not go alone. No names, no sorrow, only the road and what was on it. And there was one rule about the book, older than any man now walking it. You may leave it only after you have written your own line. To set it down unwritten is to hand over a watch you never kept. Berrien had carried it for 8 months. He put that away, the way you put away a stone in your boot, when there is nowhere to sit down. And he kept walking. The wind came off the ridge and turned the rain sideways into his face, and somewhere at the back of his skull, in the voice of a man 8 months dead, he heard it. No one breaks in a day. A man ruins himself by carrying one more day, what he thought he could carry. Therien had said that, on a dry hill, in daylight, with bread in his hand, and he had meant it as a joke about somebody else. Most true things are said that way. Berrien read the land as he moved, because that was the older habit, and it did not require him to be awake. The birches here grew thin and crooked, and leaned all one way, which meant wind off the Etimores most of the year. The stone underfoot had begun to change. Less soil, more grey bone of the hills, pushing up through it. The ridge was behind him now, and somewhere beyond it, 3 days on, there was a river he did not intend to reach tonight. Tonight he needed a roof, any roof. And then, between one gust and the next, in the half-second of quiet that comes when the wind changes its mind, he heard it. Not thunder, voices. He stopped. Not all at once. A man who stops all at once in open country has just told the hillside where he is. He let the step finish, let his weight settle forward, and simply did not take the next one. The rain went on falling around him, indifferent. Sound is a difficult thing in weather. Rain eats the high notes, and a slope will hand you a sound from a place it never was. Therien had once made him stand on a wet ridge for 3 hours, until he could tell a fox in bracken from a man being careful. He had hated it. He had used that lesson perhaps 400 times since. Now he waited for the gap in the wind. It came. Voices. South and east, down where the birches thickened toward the stream bed. 200 paces, he counted. Not the voices. Voices lie. He counted the other things. Wet feet finding bad ground and not caring. The scrape of iron hung badly on a belt. A short bark of a word, and a second answering from further left than the first, which told him more than either word did. 6, perhaps 7, spread wider than men who wished to stay together. They were not being careful. They did not think anyone was near enough to hear. Gundabad. Anything out of the Etimors this far south, this late in the year, moving loud at night. That was Northhawks. And Northhawks on this side of the hills in autumn meant one thing. They were going down to sit on the road. In a few days someone would come around a bend in daylight and think himself safe. He filed it. It would go in the book. That was what the book was for, and they had his trail. He had crossed the open shoulder of the hill an hour ago because it was faster, and faster had been the right choice at the time. The right choice at the time is how a man ends up being followed. So, not running, not out of pride. Pride is a luxury, and he had pawned his years ago. Running is loud, and it spends in 4 minutes the one thing he still had in supply. What he had was slowness. What he had was every hour Tharian had made him stand in the rain. He moved, down and left, into the fold where the water was going. The stream bed ran 3 feet of black water. It took him to the shin, then the knee, and the cold went through him like a struck bell. He did not gasp. He had trained himself out of gasping long ago, and it had cost him. Water kills a trail. Water kills a scent. Water was the only ally he had tonight, and it had been trying to kill him for 2 days. And on a dry day, that would have been funny. 40 paces downstream he found it. A birch come down in some older storm, roots torn into a wall of earth and stone, the hollow beneath it black and nearly dry, exactly the shape of a man who has stopped mattering. He put himself into it, pulled the cloak over the pale of his hands, chin down, became a root, and they came. He heard them reach the bank above him, the checking, one of them saying something short and angry, then the sound of them spreading along the water, looking for where the trail resumed, finding nothing, because there was nothing. Feet directly above him, the earth shifted against his shoulder, and a thin run of cold soil went down inside his collar. He did not move. He did not breathe out. He counted his own heartbeats, slower than they had any right to be, because a body will learn anything if you teach it long enough. Then the lightning came. The world went white for half a second, and he saw them, not imagined, saw. Wet hide gone black, iron bent to no shape a smith would own. One of them turned half toward him, with its arm across its face, hating the light, flinching from it the way a man flinches from a shout. That was what he kept, more than the fear, that they hated the light, that the storm was worse for them than for him, and that it was the only thing standing between him and 7 blades. The dark came back down. They moved off along the water. He stayed in the roots long after the sound of them was gone, because moving too early is how careful men die, and he intended to be an old one. And in the waiting, with the water rising against his boot, the thought came in a voice not his own. Going on is not courage. Courage is a moment, and it passes. Going on is a habit, and a habit carries you after you are finished. He was finished. He had been finished since the ridge. The habit picked him up out of the roots and pointed him uphill. The climb took the rest of what he had. The hill went up in shelves, soil then loose scree, then the grey bone of the land pushing through the grass in slabs, and the rain made every one of them a decision. He went down onto his hands twice. The second time he stayed there, forehead against wet stone, and let himself understand how tired he was. A man who lies to himself about that makes his mistake later, at a worse height. Then he got up. The low and behind, the orcs had gone on their way. He had heard them go, down the stream bed and then south, keeping to the low ground and well clear of the stone. He thought he knew why. Not the tells, that the tells were reason enough. There were trolls in these hills, and the stone here stood in shapes that were almost shoulders, almost a bent back, almost a face. Daylight had made every one of them, but that was not it. The stone was slow. It was loud underfoot. It broke ankles, and it gave no cover from above. Orcs going down to sit on the road had no reason to spend a night in it. They had not been hunting him. They had been walking, and he had been in the way. And now he was not. There was something in that a younger man might have found insulting. He came up over the last shelf, and the wind hit him full, straight off the north, and he put his shoulder into it and kept walking, and the lightning showed in the tower. It stood on the crown of the hill, or what was left of it did. Perhaps 40 feet still standing on the northern side, sheared off jagged, the top open to the sky. 2 great floor beams remained, black and thick as a man's body, angled down into nothing. Around the base lay the rest of it, in a long tongue of fallen blocks, half swallowed by turf, and 300 autumns of leaves. The dark came back and took it away again. Berrien did not need the light. He had known it was there since a ridge, the way you know a door in a house you grew up in. It was in the book. 4 hands before his, a man whose name no one living had ever spoken, had written 11 words about this hill, and one of them was shelter. He had been walking toward those 11 words for 2 days. He came in from the east, which was slower, because he did not want the open ground on the western face. He passed a block the size of a cart, and then another, and saw that they had been dressed, squared, faced, the tooling still visible under the moss. Someone had cut these stones and been proud of them. The base of the tower rose out of the ground, and he came into its lee, and the wind stopped. It did not soften, it stopped. 40 feet of standing stone took it away entirely, and the absence was so complete that Berrien put a hand to the wall for balance, because his body had leaned into that wind for 2 hours and had forgotten how to stand without it. Rain still fell, straight down now, almost gentle. He could hear his own breathing and water running off the stone above him in 3 separate small voices. It was not shelter, but it was the first thing all night that was not actively trying to take him apart. He rested there a moment. Then he began to look for the way in, and it was while his hand travelled along the wall at shoulder height, feeling for the edge of a doorway, that his fingers went into the stone. Not a crack, a cut. He stopped, brought his other hand up, traced it. Runes, deep carved and softened by weather, but there, a line of them at eye height, and he could feel the strokes under his fingers, the way a blind man reads a face. Angular, regular, cut by someone who intended the work to outlive him. Berrien had grown up with these letters. Every Dunedain child of the north did, though fewer in every generation. He put his forehead near the stone and read them with his hands, one character at a time, and then, lower on the same block, closer to where his hip was, his fingers found something else. More cutting, but wrong, shallow, hurried. The strokes uneven, some of them slipping off at the end where the tool had jumped. The same letters more or less, yet held like a knife rather than a chisel, by a hand that had learned the shapes without ever learning what they were for. Berrien crouched in the dark with one hand on each line. 2 hands, 2 sentries between them. Someone had built this tower, and someone else had taken it. He knew what the deep lines said, not because he could read it in the dark, but because there were only ever 4 or 5 things such a line ever said, and the shape of the first word told him which one this was. A watchpost, a name, a king, a year, the old formula. This tower was built in the reign of, and here is a man who set the stone, and here is what it was for. Watch. That was the word his fingers had found first. Berrien sat down with his back to the block, out of the rain, and let his hands rest on his knees. And for a little while he did not move at all. The book against his chest had 11 words about this hill. But the men who had cut this stone had put down a whole sentence, and they had done it in a language that was already old when they carried it out of the sea. His father had told him about the sea, not as a place, as a thing that had happened. They had been sitting outside in the summer near Fornost, close enough to the old ruin that you could see the line of the wall against the sky. And his father had pointed at it with a piece of bread and started somewhere in the middle, the way men do when they assume you already know. There had been an island in the west, the greatest gift ever given to men, and men had lived on it for 3,000 years and grown tall and long-lived and wise, and had built ships that could reach any shore in the world. And at the end of it, they had grown afraid of dying. And being afraid, they had listened to the wrong voice. And being wrong, they had sailed west against the powers themselves. And the sea had taken them, all of it. The island, the harbours, the white towers, the libraries, the whole 3,000 years. down in a single day. 9 ships came out of that. 9 ships blown east ahead of the drowning, carrying the few who had refused to sail with the rest. Elendil and his sons and the households of the faithful. They had come ashore in the storm on a coast they did not know, and they had stood on the wet stones of a foreign country and understood that everything behind them was water. Berian had always found that part difficult. As a boy, he had asked his father what they did next. His father had said, "They got up and built." It was not the answer a boy wants. A boy wants to hear what they felt. It was, he thought now, the only answer there was. Men who have lost everything do not have feelings first. They have a shore and daylight and a certain number of hours before dark, and hands. They made a kingdom of it, Arnor. It ran from the blue mountains to the great river, and it was not a kingdom of survivors huddling in a cave. It was roads and quarries and mills, and towns that had names, and stone cut so well that a man could still feel the tool marks on it 2,000 years later in the rain. They were building for people who had not been born yet. That was the thing about the work. They were building for him. And on the shoulder of the hills to the south, on a hill much like this one, they had raised a tower called Amon Sul. Weathertop men called it now, and men climbed it and ate their lunch on it, and never wondered. But it had been the greatest of the northern towers, and in it they had set one of the seeing stones out of the west, and from it the kings could look across the whole of Eriador and see what moved. A watchtower is only a place to stand. What made it a watchtower was that someone was standing in it, in bad weather, on a night when nothing happened, and the night after that, and the one after that, and this one, this broken thumb of rock on a nameless hill, with the rain coming through the top of it. This had been one of the small ones, an outpost, a pair of men, a fire, a horn, a line of sight south to the next hill, and north to the moors. There would have been a track up the eastern side, the same one he had just climbed, kept clear then, a store of wood under a roof, a rope. Somebody had spent a season of his life cutting these letters for 2 men and a fire. Berian put his palm flat against the stone. It was very cold and very solid, and it had been doing its work for longer than any name he knew. And below the good line, under his other hand, the bad one. Berian traced it again. The tool had been a knife or a bad chisel, and the man holding it had been in a hurry, or angry, or cold, or all three. The letters were the right letters. That was the strange part. Whoever cut them had known the shapes. He simply had not known what the shapes were worth. He knew roughly what it said too. There was a name in it, and the name was not a northern name. Berian let his hand fall. The kingdom had not been taken. That was the thing men got wrong when they told it in taverns, because taken is a good word for a story, and a bad word for what happened. Arnor had not fallen to an army. It had been divided by brothers. 3 sons, 3 claims, 3 kingdoms out of one. and each of them smaller and prouder and less able to hold a road. Arthedain in the north and west, which kept the line and the old ways longest. Cardolan in the south, which kept the wealth and the good ground and the ports. And Rudour, here, the eastern piece, the poorest and the hardest, all hills and stone and weather, with the least of everything and the longest border to watch. Berrien had always thought that if you wanted to know how a thing would end, you looked at which brother got the hills. Rudour did not fall either. Rudour thinned. The old blood there was already the least of it, and every generation there was less. It is a slow thing, and it does not announce itself. A daughter marries out, a son goes south and does not come back. A line that once numbered 40 numbers 11, and the 11 are tired. Men came down out of the hills, hard men, men who had never been of the faithful and owed the sea nothing. And they married in, and then they held land, and then they held offices, and then 1 year there was a lord in the high seat who could not have named his own great-grandfather. It did not look like a disaster while it was happening. Nothing does. The roads were still walked, the tolls were still taken. There were still men on the watchtowers, and if fewer of them could read what was carved on the doorpost, that seemed a small thing beside the price of grain. And then there was a year when the tolls went to a different place, and men noticed and did not say. And a year when the watch on the eastern hills was cut in half for reasons of expense, and men noticed and did not say. And a year when a captain out of the north came down to the high seat and was made welcome and given a room, and men noticed and did not say. And by the time anyone in Arthedain understood that Rudour had changed hands, it had been in the other hand for a long while. Nothing rots in a night. First you stop looking, then you forgive yourself for not looking. The fooling comes third, and it is the easy part. Berrien sat with that a while, because it was not only about a kingdom, and he knew it. Every man who has let something go bad knows the shape of it. There is never a morning when you decide. There is only a long row of mornings when you do not. And each one of them is reasonable, and the sum of them is not. And what came down out of the north to meet that thinning had a name, though Berrien did not say it here, on this hill in the dark. Angmar, a realm made for one purpose, by one will, on the far side of the moors, and its whole work for 600 years was the unmaking of what the 9 ships had built. It did not need to conquer Rudour. It only needed to wait until Rudour was worth having cheaply. So this tower had woken up one autumn as somebody else's tower. Not stormed, not burned. Just one day, a different pair of men climbing the eastern track, with different iron on their belts, and one of them bored enough on a wet evening to take out a knife and cut his master's name under the old line. Berian wondered whether that man had thought of it as a victory. Probably not. Probably he had thought of it as a job, and the weather, and how long until he could go down. Most of the harm in the world is done by men who are merely uncomfortable and doing what they were told. The rain came on again, harder, and ran off the block above and made a curtain in front of him. 2 hands, one that built, one that took. And 2,000 years later, a 3rd hand, wet and cold and shaking slightly, resting on both of them at once. The rain eased a little, and in the easing, Berian heard the hill go quiet around him, and the quiet let the rest of it come. Amonsul went first. The great tower, the one with the stone in it that could see. Angmar came down on it in the winter and burned it, and the tower that had watched all of Eriador for 1,000 years was blinded in a night. They saved the seeing stone. They carried it west to Fornost and set it there, and men said the north had held. But the tower was gone, and a stone that can see is only worth what it is set into. After that it was long, not dramatic, long. 6 generations of a war that was mostly winters, mostly hunger, mostly small forts holding on, and then not holding on. There are no songs about most of it, because most of it was men standing on walls in bad weather, waiting for something that came in the spring. Cardland died first, and its last men made their stand in the Barrow Downs. And what happened to them afterward in those green mounds is a thing Berian did not care to think about at night. And then Fornost, the last city of the north. Berian had walked in it. Every one of his people did, once. The way you visit a grave. Streets you can still follow. Doorsteps worn hollow by feet, standing in grass, with no door and no house behind them. Arvedui was king, and Arvedui was the last one. The city fell in the deep of winter, and the king went north with a handful of men, because north was the only direction left, and he wintered with the fisher folk on the ice at the top of the world. In the spring a ship came for him. He got aboard. The ice took the ship. The Palantiri went down with him into that water, and they are down there still, and no one has looked through them since. That is how the line of kings in the north ended. Not in a battle, in cold water, in the dark, a long way from anyone. The help came the year after. It always does. A fleet out of the south, and out of Linden the elven host, and at their head a lord riding in from the havens, whose name was Glorfindel. Berian had heard that charge described by men, who had it from men, who had it from others, and it had thinned in the telling, the way everything does. But one detail always survived, and it was never the numbers or the ground. It was the light, that in the grey of a northern spring, on a field of mud, there had come a rider whom the servants of Angmar could not look at. They broke him. The witch king of Angmar, who had eaten the north for 600 years, ran from that field. and the elf lord let him go. And when the captains would have hunted him down, Glorfindel spoke, and what he said was this: "Do not pursue him. You will not return to this land. Far off yet is his doom, and not by the hand of man will he fall." Berian had turned that over since he was a boy. Not by the hand of man. Everyone he had ever heard say it said it the same way, as a comfort, as a thing already settled. He had never been able to hear it as comfort. It sounded to him like a door left open somewhere, in some year no one alive would see. And the north was saved, and the north was empty. There was no kingdom to give back. The city was rubble and the fields had gone back to thorn. The people had gone south, or into the earth, or into the west, and the ones who stayed were too few to be called a people at all. What was left was some hundreds of families who kept the old blood and the old letters, and quietly the air of Isildur, and who took as their work the roads and the empty country, and the things that came out of it. No crown, no pay, no thanks. In Bree they called them vagabonds and watched their purses. Some things you win and nothing comes back. Winning owes you nothing. Work done anyway is called work. Work done for return is called trade. And Glorfindel, Berian thought, is alive tonight. That was the strangest part of all of it. He is at Imladris, 3 days east of where I am sitting, across Sabruanin. The man who broke Angmar is 3 days away, and I am here in the rain, with a wet book, doing the same job. The cold had got into him properly now, sitting still. That was the danger of stopping outside, and he knew it. And he stayed 1 minute longer anyway, because it was Therian who had told him about Fornost, sitting on a wall in the sun, with bread. Berian had been 11 when his father died, and 14 when his mother followed, and neither of those is unusual among his people, and both of them are the whole world when they happen to you. There was an ant for a while. There was a smith in a village near the Brandywine, who took him for a season and found him useless, and said so kindly. And then there was a tall grey man who came through in the autumn, looking for nobody in particular, who watched him try to split wood for most of an afternoon, and then said without any ceremony at all, "You are holding it like you are angry with it." That was Therian. He was not a warm man. Berian wanted to be clear about that even now, even to himself, because the dead get smoothed down if you are not careful, and the smoothing is a kind of forgetting. Therian was dry, and often silent for whole days, and he had a way of saying nothing at all, in response to something you were proud of, that could take the skin off you. He was 55 when they met, and he looked 40, and he was, in fact, considerably older than he looked, in either direction. He taught by making Berian do things badly for a long time. Fire in wet country, 6 weeks of it. Berian had not understood, at 19, why a man would spend 6 weeks of a life on fire when there were swords in the world. He understood at 26, on a moor, at night, with a broken arm and a flint. Ground, how to read a slope for water and a wood for men. How to tell a track made by something walking from a track made by something being dragged, and why the second one means you leave. Weather, which Therion held to be a language and not a mood. Bones, which berries, how to speak to a farmer so that he tells you the truth about what he saw in his field, which is harder than it sounds, because a frightened man will always tell you a better story than the one he has. And silence, the 3 hours on the wet ridge, and the 400 times since. Therion had said once that most men die because they are in a hurry to be somewhere, and the rest die because they were bored on the one night it mattered. And the book, Therion had shown him that in the second year, in a shelter much like the one under his feet, and he had been almost formal about it, which was not like him. He had taken it out of his shirt and put it on the stone between them and said, "This is the oldest thing you will ever be trusted with, and it is a notebook, and do not let that fool you." Then he had explained the rule. You write your line before you leave it, not after, not next time. A man who sets it down unwritten has handed on a watch he never kept, and the next man will walk out on what he thinks is good information, and it will be a lie, and it will be your lie, and you will not be there to be told about it. Berian at 20 had said something clever. He could not now recall what. Therion had let it sit in the air until it died of exposure, and then had gone on to the next thing. That was his whole method of correction, and it worked better than shouting ever had on anyone. 22 years they walked together, not constantly. Rangers do not travel in pairs by preference, and there were seasons and whole years apart. But there was a rhythm to it, a rough one, of meeting where the roads crossed and comparing what each had seen and going out again. There had been a night near the Weather Hills, years in, when Berian had done something well, not remarkably, well, and Therion had said, that was right, and nothing else, and had gone to sleep. Berian had lain awake for an hour with it, foolishly pleased, like a boy. Berian had never once thanked him. It had not seemed like the kind of thing you said to a man who was still alive. 8 months ago they had gone to Fornost. There had been reports all that winter, from farms at the edge of the empty country, of something moving in the ruins. Nothing precise, dogs that would not go north. A boy who had seen a light where no light should be. The kind of report that is almost always nothing, and is occasionally the beginning of a very bad year. So they went, as men of their people had gone for 1,000 years, quietly, 2 of them, to look and come back and write it down. They watched the ruin for 7 days from the western slope. That was Therion's doing. 7 days of lying in cold heather doing nothing. when 3 would have satisfied any reasonable man, because Tharion held that a thing which hides will always eventually behave as though nobody is watching. On the 7th night it did. They had eaten cold as always. It had been clear, which Berian still resented, because a clear night is a beautiful thing, and it should not be allowed to be the setting for that. Berian did not go over the details. He had gone over them enough in 8 months to know they did not improve. What he kept was this, that it had happened in the dark, that there had been a sound he had never heard before and has not heard since, that Tharion had made a decision in about the time it takes to draw breath, and the decision had been correct, and it had also been the end of him, and that he had known it while he made it. That was the part, not the horror, the arithmetic. A man looking at a situation and understanding what it would cost and paying it anyway. On a Tuesday, in the dark, with nobody watching. Berian had come out. That had been the point of the decision, and it had worked. In the grey of the morning, he had gone back up and found him, and had done what could be done. And it was not much, and it took a long time. And then he had opened his friend's shirt and taken out the waxed case, because that was the rule, and the rule does not care how you feel. He remembered the weight of it, changing hands. Nothing in the world weighs less than a small book. He had carried it out of Fornos that day, and he had carried it every day since, through the spring and the summer, and into this autumn, over about 900 miles of the north, and he had not written a line in it, not one. He had told himself several things about that the right shelter had not come, that there had been nothing worth recording, which was a lie of a particularly poor quality, because he had crossed the whole north and seen a great deal, that he would do it properly when he had a night and a fire. All of these were true, in the way that a stone in your boot is true. None of them was the reason. The reason was that the last hand in that book was Tharion's, and while there was nothing under it, the book was still his. Do not carry the one you lost. Carry what he taught you. One grows heavier every day, the other grows lighter and stays. Tharion had said that about somebody else, years ago, to a younger man who was making a fool of himself over a grief. And he had said it without much sympathy, and Berian had thought at the time that it was a hard thing to say. He still thought so. He had simply stopped thinking it was wrong. The rain came down. Berian put both hands on the wet stone and pushed himself up onto his feet, which took longer than it should have, and he stood for a moment in the lee of a tower that 2 kingdoms had failed to keep, holding a book he had not written in for 8 months. Then he went to find the way down. It took him a quarter of an hour, working along the base of the wall in the dark with his hands, and he found it where such things always are, on the sheltered side, under a fall of blocks, a gap where the ground had subsided away from the stone. Not a doorway. A doorway would have been filled long ago. This was the failure of the earth around a corner of the foundation, and it went down at an angle, and it was black. He put his head into it and smelled dry dust. After 2 days of water, dust was the best thing he had ever smelled. He went down on his back, feet first, which is the only sensible way into a hole you cannot see the bottom of. The gap took him at a shallow angle for the length of his body, and then his heels found air, and then stone, and he let himself down into it, and stood up in the dark with his hands out, dry, cold and thick with dust, and utterly dry. He was in the head of a stair. He could feel the wall of it on his right, dressed stone, and the first step under his boot. And he went down with one hand on the wall, counting steps, the way you do underground, because the number matters on the way back up in the dark. 11 steps. The air changed as he went, losing the last of the wind, gaining something older and more settled, then a landing, then a door. Oak. He found the grain of it with his palm, and the iron banding, and the iron was rough with rust, but the wood under it was hard as a stone. Oak in a dry cellar will outlast every man who ever touched it. It had swollen in its frame over the centuries, and it did not want to move. Berrien set his shoulder into it low, near the hinge side where the leverage is, and pushed steadily rather than sharply. Because a door like this breaks men before men break it. And after a moment, it gave with a long, low groan that he felt in his back teeth. He went in. The air inside was still, and had been still for a very long time. It smelled of dust and cold stone, and faintly of old smoke, which is a smell that will sit in a hearth for 100 years, and mean nothing except that men were once warm here. And then he turned around and found what he was hoping for. A bar, a beam of oak as thick as his forearm, lying in the dust against the wall, where the last man out had left it, and 2 stone sockets cut into the jambs to take it. He lifted it. It was heavier than he expected, and he was glad of that. He set one end into the far socket, swung it across, and dropped it home. And the world went quiet. Not silent. He could still hear the storm. But it had gone from a thing happening to him to a thing happening elsewhere. A long grey rumour up above the stone, and the wind that had been shouting in his ears for 2 days was simply not there anymore. Berrien stood in the dark with his hands still on the bar and listened to himself breathe. And it was very loud, and it was the loudest thing in the room. It is a strange thing to be safe. The body does not believe it at once. He could feel his shoulders still up around his ears, still braced for the next gust, and it took some seconds for them to come down. And when they did, the whole weight of his own head seemed to arrive on his neck all at once. Stopping is not quitting. Most men do not give up because they gave up. They give up because they never stopped. Therian again, of course. Everything tonight was Therian. He had said it about a man in Bree, who worked himself into the ground for 11 years, and then one spring simply did not get up one morning, and everyone said what a shame. He never complained. Therion had thought that was the worst part. He made himself do the work before the rest. This was drilled deep, and it did not require enthusiasm. He went around the room with both hands on the walls, all four sides, counting his paces. 12 by 15, near enough. Barrel vaulted, the ceiling low enough at the edges that he had to duck, and high enough at the crown to stand. Stone floor, swept smooth by nothing but time. On the north wall his hands found a hearth, a proper one, cut back into the thickness of the wall, with a stone lintel and a flue behind it, and beside it a low bench of stone, built into the masonry. Iron hooks in the wall at head height, 4 of them. No second door, no window, one way in, and it was barred, and the bar was oak. It occurred to Bedtime, standing in the dark with his fingers on cold iron, that this was the safest place he had been in 8 months. Then, and only then, he began to put himself down. There is an order to it, and the order is not sentimental. It is the order that leaves a man least helpless for the shortest time. And Bedtime had been taught it by someone who had been taught it, and it went back further than either of them. Bow first. He unstrung it in the dark by feel, easing the limb down against his thigh, and slipped the string into the flat pouch inside his shirt, where his body heat would dry it. A wet string is a stick with a lie attached. Then the bow itself onto the highest hook, up out of the damp of the floor. Quiver beside it, opened, tipped slightly, so what water had got in could find its way out. He counted the arrows by touch as he did it. 19. He had gone out with 24. Then the cloak. He unpinned it at the shoulder and took the weight of it in both hands, and it was appalling. 2 days of rain had made it into something else entirely. A hide, a carcass, and when he lifted it clear, the cold air went straight through his shirt and found every place the wool had been keeping warm. He got it onto 2 hooks, spread wide rather than folded, because a cloak hung folded will still be wet in the morning, and a cloak hung wide might not be. The leather next, deer hide, boiled and shaped, 6 years old and mended in 4 places, and it had stopped anything that needed stopping twice. The jerkin was laced at the side, and the laces were swollen and his fingers were not good. It took him a long while, and there was a point in the middle of it where he had to stop and hold his hands under his arms until they came back enough to be useful. He did not curse. Cursing at cold hands is a young man's habit, and it does not warm them. Out of it at last, and the shirt underneath was wet through, and there was a smell of himself that 2 days of weather will produce in any man. Onto a hook. Boots off, which was the worst of it, and the best. The leather had gone soft and dark, and he had to work them down over swollen feet. And the cold that came off his own skin when they came free was shocking. He set them mouth down against the wall near the hearth. The sword he did not hang. He laid it on the stone bench along the wall, on its side, hilt toward the room, near where he would lie. Not out of fear, out of habit so deep, it no longer had a feeling attached to it. 26 years of putting a sword where his hand would find it. He set the waxed case beside it, very carefully. And then, before anything else, the flue. Because a fire on a hill in a country with orcs in it is a decision, not a comfort. And Berrien had watched a man make that decision badly once, and had helped bury the result. He felt up into the throat of the hearth, with his arm to the shoulder. Dust came down on his face, old soot, brittle as ash. His fingers found the sides of the flue narrowing, and then a bend, and above the bend, air moving. Not much. A slow, steady pull, cold on his wet forearm, drawing. 2,000 years and it was still drawing. He tried to think it through the way Tharian would have. The flue went up into the standing wall. The wall was sheared off jagged at 40 feet and open to the sky. And the whole crown of the tower was a ruin of broken stone. Smoke going up that flue would not come out of a chimney like a signal. It would find the gaps and the fall in blocks and disperse, and it would come out cold and thin and scattered. And it was raining, and the wind off the moors was still strong enough to tear a plume apart in a dozen yards. It would do. He checked the hearth itself as well, and found what he had expected. A small heap of old charcoal at the back, the last fire some other man had built, gone to nothing centuries ago. And under the bench, dry and grey and light as paper, a handful of sticks. Somebody had left kindling. Berrien sat back on his heels in the dark with those sticks in his hand, and felt something in his chest move that he was too tired to name. Nobody had asked that man to do that. He had gone out, and the next one had come in. And here it was. It would have to. He was too far gone to spend the night without a fire, and he knew it. And knowing it was itself a kind of reckoning. The tinder came out of the innermost pocket of the pack, wrapped in waxed cloth, inside a second wrapping of oiled leather. Charred linen and a little dry moss, and a pinch of birch bark, shaved fine as hair. It was the driest thing Berrien owned, and it had stayed dry through 2 days that had soaked the marrow of him. Because the rule is simple and old and absolute. You get wet, your tinder does not. A man who lets his tinder get wet has decided without meaning to that he does not intend to be warm again. He built it small. That is the part men get wrong when they are cold. And being cold is exactly when they get it wrong. Because the body wants a bonfire now, and the body is an idiot. He laid the charred linen in the nest of moss. He set the shaved bark beside it, not on it. He arranged the grey sticks from under the bench in a loose lean, thin ones first, and then broke 2 of the thicker ones over his knee, and set them within reach, but not in the pile. he sat back and made himself wait a moment, and looked at what he had made, and moved one stick, flint and steel, out of the pouch. The steel was a plain, curved strike bar, worn thin on the working edge by 20 years of exactly this. And the flint was a good one. He had picked up on a riverbank in the spring, and had been quietly pleased with ever since. The first strike gave nothing but a smell. The second threw sparks wide, and they died in the air, orange for half a heartbeat, gone. The third put one squarely into the charred linen, and a red eye opened in the black cloth and began, very slowly, to spread. He bent down to it. This was the moment. Everything before it was preparation, and everything after it was maintenance. And the whole business turned on the next 30 seconds, and on nothing else. He cupped his hands around the nest and brought it up close to his face and breathed on it. Not blowing, breathing. A long, low, patient stream of air from deep in his chest, the way you would breathe on the hands of someone you loved. The red eye widened and brightened, and dimmed and widened again, and he did not hurry it, and he did not stop. Smoke came first. It went up past his eyes and stung them, and he kept breathing. And then the flame, a small yellow tongue of it, no bigger than a thumbnail, standing up out of the moss and wavering. And Berrien set the nest down into the sticks with both hands, and did not touch it again. It caught the bark caught the thin sticks, and the room began to exist. Light came up the walls and found the curve of the vault above him, and the stone turned from black to grey, to a warm, dull gold, and the shadows of his own hands went up the ceiling, enormous and slow. The hearth wall held the light and gave it back. He had not seen the room he was in until that moment, and it was better than he had let himself hope. A fire will not be hurried. It starts small, is sheltered, is fed, and only then does it warm. Every good thing arrives in that order. Most men only want the third part first. Therion had said that in the 6th week of the 6 weeks. And Berrien, 19 and furious and soaked, had understood, only that he was being lectured. He had understood the rest of it at various points over the following 20 years, in pieces, the way you do. The flame took the first of the thick sticks. He fed the second in and heard it hiss once and then take heat. It arrived on his face before it arrived anywhere else, and it was almost painful, the skin of his cheeks not knowing what to do with it. His eyes watered. He let them. He turned his hands over in front of it, palms, then backs, then palms, and the feeling came back into the fingers as a deep ache that was worse than the numbness had been, and infinitely better than the numbness had been. Berrien sat on the stone floor of a room that 2,000 years of weather had not been able to get into, in front of the first fire he had seen in 2 days, and let it hurt. When he could feel his hands again, he stood up and looked at the room properly, and the room had things to say. The walls near the hearth were marked, not scratched, small, shallow, made with a knife point or a nail, by men sitting where he was sitting now. And there were a great many of them. Some were simple, a short vertical stroke, and beside it another and another, grouped in fives and crossed through, the oldest counting there is. One night, one night, one night. Some were more than that. A rune, the first letter of a name, cut once and left. A crude little device that might have been a house, or might have been a star. And there were others, in a different hand and a much later century, that were not northern at all, and one of those had been struck through afterward by somebody else, hard, 3 times, with real anger in it. Berrien found he liked whoever had done that. He would never know his name, and the man had been dust for 600 years. And still, somebody had come back into this room and objected. He walked the wall slowly with the firelight moving on it. 20 of them perhaps a few more. Some of them had sat here in the days when this hill had a garrison, and a road, and a name in a ledger somewhere. Some of them had sat here afterward, in the long emptiness, doing what he was doing. None of them had left a story. Not one of them had written down what he felt, or who he missed, or why he was tired. Only I was here, the place held. And that, Berrien thought, is most of what any of us actually manage. Then he found the hollow. It was in the stone of the wall beside the hearth, at the height of a seated man's shoulder, a cut recess the length of 2 hands and the depth of 1, squared, deliberate, dressed as carefully as anything else in the room, which meant it had been made when there was still a kingdom to make things carefully for. It was empty, and it was clean, and the dust in it was thinner than the dust on the bench. Berrien stood in front of it with the firelight on his face, and understood. In the ordinary way you understand something you have known for years, exactly what it was for. Not for a lamp, for the book. Every shelter on the old line had one. He had taken the book out of a hollow like this, in a cave above the Horwell, 9 years ago, and had put it into one, under a bridge near Tharbad the winter after. And it had been in and out of 100 such holes, for longer than the Shire had been settled. This one had been waiting a long while. He put 2 fingers into it, and ran them along the back of the recess, and the stone there was smooth in a way the rest of the wall was not, worn faintly hollow by 1,000 small placements and liftings, a groove made by nothing but a book being set down and taken up again. He did not put it in, not yet. He was not entitled to yet. That was not a feeling. That was the rule. And he had been on the wrong side of it since spring. And he was not going to make it worse by cheating at the last. Instead, he took the case down from beside the sword and brought it to the fire and opened it, and did the thing that mattered more tonight than his own dry shirt. The stitching along the bottom seam had let water in. Not much. A dark tongue of damp had crept into the lower corner of the pages, and about 1/3 of the way up, and the cover was cool and heavy with it. You worked the book open a section at a time, gently, the way you open something old that is willing but not eager. And he laid it on the stone bench where the heat of the hearth wall came through, close but not close enough to scorch. Then he went along the damp pages and separated them, one from another, with the edge of his thumbnail. 51 pages carried some part of the wet. He counted them because counting is what you do when a job is going to be long. And because Therion had once told him that a man who knows how much work is left is a man who will finish it. He did them all. It took a long time and it was slow, careful, useless-looking work. And outside the storm went on above 2,000 years of stone. And Bedtime, half naked and filthy and bleeding under his ribs, knelt in front of a fire in a dead kingdom and dried a notebook. While the pages dried, he saw to himself, and he did it in the same order and with the same attention, because a man is also equipment. The bandage had to come off wet. He soaked it first from the water skin rather than pulling, and worked it loose in stages, and it still took skin with it in 2 places, and he breathed out slowly through his nose and let it. Underneath, the cut ran along under his left ribs, about the length of his hand, clean edges, deep enough to have wanted stitches 2 nights ago, and too late for them now. The flesh around it was angry and hot to the touch, but the heat stopped where it should, and there were no red lines running away from it. He looked at it for a while in the firelight, honestly, the way you would look at another man's wound. It would hold. He washed it. Then he took from the bottom of the pack a small twist of cloth, holding dried atlas leaves, crumbled them between his palms, and the smell came up into the room, sharp and green, and impossibly out of season. He pressed them to the cut and bound it with the driest linen he had, and pulled the wrap firm but not tight, and tied it off left-handed with his teeth in the knot, which is a skill nobody sets out to learn. Then he dressed, which is to say he put on the least wet of what he had. The spare shirt from the bottom of the pack, kept in oiled cloth for exactly this hour, went over his head, dry and warm from the fire, and the sensation of it was so far out of proportion to the object that he sat still for a moment afterward, with his arms in the sleeves, and did not move. Then he ate, dried meat hard as a strap, that had to be held in the mouth a while before it would consent to be food at all. Bread that had been bread 4 days ago and was now chiefly an idea about bread. He worked at them slowly, without pleasure, chewing far longer than the food required, because tired men choke, and because there was no hurry anymore. Water, more water. Being kind to yourself when you are tired is not weakness. It is the hardest discipline. No one sees it, no one praises it, and no one notices when you fail. Only there is less of you afterward. Therion had never said that one. Bedtime had worked that one out himself, over 8 months, mostly by getting it wrong, And then when the meal was down and the fire had settled into a steady, orange working heat, he allowed himself the pipe. It came out of its own pouch, a short thing of black cherry wood, the bowl gone dark and smooth on one side, where his thumb had rested for 11 years. The stem mended once with a whipping of waxed thread. It was not a good pipe. It was his, and with it the leaf. He had bought that leaf in the summer from a very small man, with a very fixed opinion about the price of it. The transaction had taken a quarter of an hour. Berrien had pointed out that he was buying a great deal of it, and that some allowance might reasonably be made. The small man had looked up at him, a long way up, and had said that the price was the price, and that if the tall gentleman found it dear, he was welcome to grow his own, and had then waited with perfect placidity to see what would happen. Berrien had paid the price. He had also, walking away, laughed for the first time that season. He filled the bowl with his thumb, tamping it in 3 stages the way it should be done, and took a splinter from the edge of the fire and drew the flame down into it. The first draw, it went through him like warm water, finding cold ground. His shoulders came down another inch. An inch he had not known was still there to come down. He let the smoke go up and watched it climb into the dark of the vault, where it turned once, slowly, in some current from the flue, and disappeared. Outside, above 2,000 years of stone, the storm went on without him. The book was dry. He took it onto his knees and sat with his back against the warm stone of the hearth wall, and the fire was low and steady now, and threw enough light to read by, if he held the page toward it. He turned to the beginning, which he had not done in years. The first pages were in a hand so old, the ink had gone brown, and the letters had a formality to them that nobody used anymore. Short entries, 4 or 5 words. Bridge sound. Ford passable at the shallow. Wolves out of the north this year. Many. No names. That was the discipline of it, and it went back to the beginning. You did not sign. You read forward and the hands changed and changed again. A man 300 years ago had written, in a cramped hand, that the eastern hills were quiet, and that this had been true for 6 years, and that he did not trust it. Another later had written a single line about a farm at the edge of the empty land, where a woman would give food to any of them who came, and had added, which is not to be abused. Berrien knew that farm. It was gone now, but somebody had written that down, and men had walked past that door respectfully for 100 years because of one line in a notebook. There was a stretch of about 40 years where the entries were very short and very frequent, and almost all of them were about numbers of orcs mostly, and where, and going which way. 12 pages of that. The handwriting gets worse as it goes, and then, on the 13th page, changes entirely, and the new hand carries on with the same road and the same country, and says nothing at all about the change. Whoever wrote through that stretch never once said that it was bad. Further on, a man had recorded a bridge as unsafe, and 2 pages later, a different hand had gone back and added under it, "Still unsafe. Do not believe him about the second span. It looks fine." Berrien laughed out loud in the empty room, and the sound surprised him, and he sat there grinning at a 200-year-old argument between 2 dead men about a bridge. And there were the other kind, rare, one every 20 or 30 pages. A hand from the last century, at the bottom of an entry about the weather, had written, "My son was born this spring at Brie." And then nothing else. And the next entry was about a landslip. Another, much older, had written after a note about wolves. "I am not as fast as I was." There were 4 more entries in that hand, then a different one. Another in the middle of a page, with no connection to anything above or below it, had simply written, "It is a good country," and had gone on. The work no one sees is a real part of the work. The seen part is a result, and the result always belongs to someone else. Berrien sat with the book open on his knees and the fire going quiet, and understood something he had been circling for 8 months without landing on. Not one of these men had known whether it mattered. Not one. They had written down a ford and a bridge and a farm and a number of wolves, and then they had died somewhere, mostly alone, mostly unrecorded, and the only reason any of it had ever mattered was that the next man had opened the book. The whole thing was held together by nothing but that. The next man opening the book. That was the whole kingdom. That was what was left of Arnor. Not the stones, and not the blood, and not the sword in the north, whatever the old women said about it. This, a wet notebook, and 100 men who never met, agreeing about something. He turned the last of the written pages toward the fire, and there it was, the last written page, and on it, 4 lines down, the handwriting he had known for 22 years. Square, unhurried, slightly cramped at the ends of the lines, because Therien had never in his life used more paper than he thought a thing deserved. Fornost. 7 days we watched. There is something below, and it. The line stopped, not trowed off, stopped in the middle of a word, the way a man stops when he lifts his head at a sound and means to come back to it in a moment. Half an inch of blank paper, and then the bottom of the page. Berrien looked at it for a long time. He had known it was there. He had carried it 900 miles. But he had not opened the book since the morning he took it. And there is a difference between knowing a thing and having it in your hands in the firelight. There was no grief in the room. That surprised him. He had been braced for something, and what came instead was quieter and much older. The way you feel standing in a house you used to live in. For 8 months he had believed, without ever putting it into words, that his job was to finish that sentence, to go back to Fornost and find out what was below, and write the end of Therien's line for him. sitting here now with the fire low. He could see that this was not a plan. It was a way of not moving. It is not yours to finish another man's sentence. It is yours to write the next one. A man does not continue from where he fell behind. He continues from where he stands. Berrien took out the lead, a short stick of it wrapped in cloth, sharpened with a knife, kept dry against exactly this. He turned the book to the next clear page. He did not touch Therian's line. He did not add to it, or explain it, or draw a mark beside it. It was his, and it was finished being written, whether it was finished or not. He began below it, on the fresh page, in his own hand. He wrote the date by the reckoning his people kept. He wrote that a Gundabad party, 6 or 7, had come down off the Etimors on this night and turned north again at the stone ground, and that their line of march was for the east road, and that anyone walking that road in the coming days should not walk it in daylight, and should not walk it alone. He wrote that the ruin on the hill above the North Fork still had its cellar, that the oak door and the bar were sound, that the flue drew, and that a man could be dry here. He wrote 3 more lines about water and a fallen crossing, and then he stopped and looked at the fire for a while, and did something that was not the custom. He wrote, "The hearth draws, the stone holds warmth till morning. Whoever you are not the first to be tired here." He closed the book. He wound the cord around the case and got up, stiff, holding the wall, and crossed to the hollow beside the hearth and set it in. It fitted the way a thing fits a place made for it. And then he stood there, with his hand still resting on it, and felt the weight go. Not a feeling, an actual physical absence, low down under the breastbone, where something had been sitting since the spring. The watch was not his anymore. He had kept it and written it, and set it down, and the next man would open it. There was nothing left to do tonight. He did not build the fire up. He let it go the way it wanted to go. The flame shortened and lay down, and turned to a low red bed, and the light in the room dropped, and the shadows came up the walls, and the vault went soft and dark above him, and the room grew smaller and closer and kinder. The stone of the hearth wall was warm all along his back. Outside, above, the storm was ending. He could hear it thinning, the wind losing its edge, the rain settling into something steady and even and far away. A sound with no threat left in it at all. He lay down on the folded cloak with his back to the warm stone. The sword was where his hand would find it. The door was barred with oak. 20 men had marked this wall, and now there were 21. His breathing slowed. The coals ticked and settled, and breathed, orange and dim and low. And Berrien, son of no one important, on a hill with no name, in a kingdom that had been gone for 800 years, closed his eyes in the warm dark and slept. He is asleep now, and the stone is warm, and the door is barred. There is nothing left tonight that needs you awake. If you are still here, thank you for keeping the watch with me. Rest well, and whatever you are carrying, remember that you are allowed to set it down. The fire will look after itself from here. Good night.